Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching this from. I'd like to welcome you to the Center for Global Development. And let me just say that I'm really excited about this event. And I'm excited about it for two reasons. One, the substance, and second, the people who are going to be participating in it. And as for the substance, as you know, I think this is the moment when there has been broad call for stepping up development financing through the multilateral development banks. And uh, the call for that is partly a reflection of just the increased need that is there for following up on the sustainable development goals and the financing related to that, and a special call that comes from the recognition that the financing of climate change related projects, of global public goods more generally, requires not just an adaptation in the roles of these institutions so that they become more aligned with responding to the challenges of today, which are cross-country in nature, but also the ability to finance them. So they have to scale up financing. And so then the question has moved on to, well, how are you going to scale up that financing? And that has brought, under the leadership first of Italy and then of Indonesia, an expert group that was created. That expert group is being charged to look exactly at how can you find ways to scale up financing using the existing capital of these institutions, but in a way that preserves their fundamental financial strength, because that has been a big part of the model of these institutions. That expert group has reported, and so now the question is, and sorry, not only has it reported, but it has reported and said, yes, indeed, there are ways to generate hundreds of billions of dollars over time in financing from these institutions by making more efficient use of their capital without damaging their financial credibility. And now the question becomes, well, how do we move forward and implement? So that's, if you like, the stage we're at. And now today, we have the opportunity to come at this from various angles. So it's a little complicated choreography, so I'll walk you through it so you don't get confused as to which stage of it we are in. Rightly, we're going to start with an address by the Minister of Finance from Indonesia, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who is sitting next to me, and she's going to be introduced by Sir Khan Ishaq Qasim, who's sitting over there. So that's sort of, if you like, part one. Then we move to part two, which is going to be a presentation of the report itself. Now, everybody's going to refer to it as a CAF report. And for anybody who by now hasn't yet followed it enough to know what it stands for, is the Capital Adequacy Framework Report. So the CAF report, Franny Loche, who was the head of that expert group, is there with us, and Franny is going to present that report. And actually, also a member of that panel is Nancy Lee, sitting in the second row over there, and also other colleagues. So that's part two. Then we move to part three, and part three is going to be a panel discussion of the report and a question and answer session where I hope many of you who have thoughts or questions on it will be able to raise them, and Franny and the other panelists will be able to answer them. I'll introduce the panelists when we get to that. And then to close it out, we're going to have a presentation, a few remarks from Domenico Panizza, who is the executive director for Italy and who's going to be here. Now, one person who is here and would have been on the program, but unfortunately has to leave earlier, but I should mention, is Rajat Kumar Mishra, who is the additional secretary in the Ministry of Finance. Now, Rajat, where are you sitting? Here a few minutes ago. But Rajat's here because I think the agenda now has to be taken forward next year under the leadership of the Indian presidency of the G20. So that's the sort of sequence. So It's all right if you don't remember all of the specific elements of this, but it's to give you a flavor of the back and forth that you'll see as people come to the stage. So with that, what I'd like to do now is hand over to Sirkani Isa Kasim to introduce the minister.
Thank you. Let me use the podium then.
Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. Your Excellency, Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Mr. Masud Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development, and the two co-chairs, Mr. Byung Sik Jung and Mr. William Rose of the International Financial Architecture Working Group or IFA-WG, Dr. Franny Lotier, the chair of the Independent Panel of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review, distinguished panel members, all participants, good afternoon. It is really a great pleasure for me to be with you, along with my Finance Minister, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, to discuss how the independent review of the MDBs Capital Adequacy Framework can help boost MDBs' role and capacity in development finance. During our presidency, Indonesia has consistently championed the needs of vulnerable low-income countries by listening to their concerns and focusing part of our program on related to how to boost the development impact of the MDBs. One of the most significant ways that we have done this is by joining the IFA Working Group co-chairs to work with Dr. Franny Lotier and her team to build on the Italian G20 presidency's work to initiate the review and to ensure the review was completed on time and the final report published. I'm sure you will hear more about the substance of the report and its recommendations today from the chair of the independent panel. However, I do want to use this opportunity to thank the independent panel and all the members of the panel for the great work they have done to critically assess MDB's capital adequacy framework and to develop recommendations that have the potential to help MDBs considerably boost their development finance impact. Also, I would like to thank the IFA Working Group chairs, Mr. William Rose and Mr. Jung Byung Sik, for their contributions and support until the final report could be presented to the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors last July in Bali, and the UK government for providing support to this secretarial work. I'm sure today's event will add a great deal of perspective to the G20 discussions on next steps, but also to lay foundation for the Indian G20 presidency work to boost further this MDB's development impact. I will stop here, and I'm keen to hear from others also on your views concerning recommendation and next step, and I'm sure also you will be very interested to hear from our keynote speaker, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The work as the G20 presidency, we have so many working groups, and this is one of the most important working group, which is critically important, especially considering what is happening today. Mr. Masud Ahmad, my colleague, good friend, President of the Center for Global Development, and Dr. Franny Lotier, the chair of Independent Panel of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review, and others, panels, members, and participants. Thank you very much to be able to be here and inviting me to discuss about one of very important topic for the G20 as well as for the world. Indonesia, as a developing country, emerging country, knows very well the crucial role of multilateral development institutions, including MDBs, in playing their supporting role for countries to meet their development needs. The recent global economic development underscore the rationale for multilateral development bank to play even bigger role in supporting many countries to cope with the current complex, challenging situation. Masud has already mentioned earlier that the commitment for the global public goods, especially with the SDG and climate change. We also have pandemic recently, which is showing that more and more is actually needed for the world to be together and how we are going to address the issue of global public goods. And the current global economic environment and situation, which is evolving into a more complex, or even in this case, I will use the word dangerous situation. Risk has escalated since the war in Ukraine, and in this case, with the geopolitical tension disrupting even further on a production side, which creating inflationary pressure due to the both food as well as energy and fertilizer. The inflationary pressure in this case has become more persistent as the commodity price skyrocketed and further supply disruption is actually getting even worsened. And we are now almost every day, as a finance minister for sure, I'm going to always follow what is going to be the response from many of the monetary authority. A very aggressive and sometimes even faster than initially anticipated monetary policy tightening has become inevitable. This leads to the significantly higher probability for global economy slip into recession. Not to mention, of course, the cost of fund for many developing or emerging countries is going to be even higher and more expensive, or even some of them, they cannot afford to go to the market at this very moment. Over the course of years, we have seen elevating market volatility, strengthening of dollar, will definitely also creating more vulnerability and bringing severe threat to financial market stability and fiscal sustainability. These are particularly imminent for many developing as well as emerging markets, such as also Indonesia, although current situation in Indonesia is much, much better than 2013 when taper tantrum was announced. The budget pressure have substantially escalated most of the emerging market and developing market in the last couple of years due to the pandemic. When we have to protect life of the people, we also have to provide support for the social protection, and we also have to provide support for the economic recovery. With the likelihood of global recession, many emerging markets in particular are facing with serious threat of multiple crises: food, energy, and climate, as mentioned earlier. Those with already high level of debt, which is most of many countries, both in the G20 as well as outside G20, will even face mounting budget pressure due to the cost of fund and also the volatility and strengthening of dollar. Those who have significant portion of their debt in a foreign currency denominated, this definitely is going to also create huge pressure. So with this kind of situation, I think the need for many countries, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Apologize. With this kind of development and as well as challenges, many countries is now in the process of how they are going to survive. So not even talking about the global public good, really rescuing and protecting their own economy is going to be a very important problem. We have just heard from the IMF that they are downgrading again for the global economic situation or projection. The growth for next year is going to be much lower, 2.7%. As the IMF predicted, the 2023 is going to be even more challenging or darker. And this is really not an encouraging for a country who now hold the presidency of G20, in which our tagline is recover together, recover stronger. What we are facing now is a much, much dire in terms of the crisis and the consequence to humanitarian even concern. So what we could do in this case in response to this escalating risk, which creating a setback for many of the development achievement that we've already achieved in the past 2 decades. The role of Multilateral Development Bank, or MDBs, certainly is becoming one of the most important one. Apart from the discussion about how we are going to solve the problem of debt, which is not sustainable in many countries, there is certainly also a need, a very strong need of new financing, which can only be actually provided by the multilateral development bank, especially when the market is not working and they are working in such a very expensive price. MDBs currently carry out their development funding mandate under huge pressure to ensure an effective resource allocation, while also the need for funding is getting better. To just save the achievement which is already being achieved by many countries, but also to address the issue of global public goods, as mentioned earlier, whether this is in the form of pandemic or climate change. This is creating a demand, a real demand for the MDB to step up and to increase their ability to respond. We are facing with the risk of the global economy that is likely to go into recession, and the reliance on the MDBs to support not only in terms of money needed, but also knowledge as well as technical assistance that is usually also needed for many developing and emerging countries when they are conducting their reform and capacity building. For this reason, increasing MDB resources capacity is definitely unquestionable. It's very urgent, need to be enhanced. Indonesia has made the priority on our G20 presidency to lead the group with the most diverse representation in ensuring that all voices are heard. Our objective to recover together and recover stronger has become an even more relevant during this current challenging environment. Strong leadership and prompt collective action are needed to maintain our global development objective. And I really welcome this panel, which is addressing the issue of how MDBs could actually respond by even using their existing balance sheet in the most creative way. This is one reason why Indonesia also fully supported the work of independent panel, because the discussion about capital adequacy framework review during the Indonesia presidency will also becoming one of the solution, which is hoping by all members, not only G20, but especially for many developing countries, which is not sitting in the G20, that they really need this kind of resources. We believe that the capital adequacy framework is the right solution that can help optimize the MDB's balance sheet, whether you are going to talk about the risk appetite, whether you are going to have a creative financing, whether you are talking about how to utilize and capitalize more callable capital, I think they are all have the potential to be explored. Nothing is actually off the table, should be there. And I think also very good for us to be able to also discuss with the rating agency as the MDB's risk as well as rating need to be continued preserved in order for them to be able to continue raise fund in a very manageable and efficient cost. The report which is showing that the free up of all this MDB's capital or balance sheet will provide more to up to 500 billion additional financing is certainly a quite promising solution under the current situation. So we are looking forward for this recommendation to be, of course, discussed, and for us to also being discussed not only in the G20, but also on the board of the IMF, World Bank, for sure, and other multilateral development bank. So we are looking forward for this discussion, which is going to be one of the very important also input for us in our Indonesia presidency. And for sure, this is going to be communicated and will be adopted by the India presidency next year. For that, I look forward for having and listening to your discussion, and I'm sure today's event will also provide more perspective for all of us who their heart and their mind is always on development and also looking for any alternatives resources that can be mobilized without jeopardizing the fundamental as well as prudential regulation within the institution as well as the financial sector globally. thank you so much for having this discussion, especially for Masood for hosting this one, and looking forward to hear from you all. Thank you.
Thank you also, Isaac, for that. So I think now is our opportunity to listen to Franny make a presentation of the report.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much, Masood, for hosting us here. It's a pleasure to be once again at CGD. And I very much enjoyed listening to the remarks of Minister Sri Mulyani, and of seeing once again Pak Shrukani with us here. Minister Sri Mulyani chaired very effectively the G20 meeting that took place in Bali, where our report was presented. So it's very good to see you here once again. It's a great pleasure for us to be able to be with this audience to talk about boosting MDB's investing capacity. I'll start first by thanking the Indonesia G20 presidency for organizing this important event here at the Center for Global Development, because by hosting this event here, it gives the opportunity for a much broader conversation around our report. So, let me see.
Now, I think you're going to be using slides, aren't you,
Yes,
Franny?
okay,
So
they're
I think
working.
what we should do, Sri Mulyani and thing is we should go sit over there,
All
and
right.
that way
Yeah, it will be easier to.
it'll be easier.
So, because it's the afternoon, we thought some visual aids may be helpful. And I'm assuming that you've all read the report, but if you haven't, this will give you a good summary of what is in the report. So, as many of you know, in July 2022 in Bali, as I just mentioned, the G20 finance ministers and the central bank governors welcomed the report of the independent review of the multilateral development banks, and particularly in the question around capital adequacy frameworks, and I had the honor to chair that independent panel. So I mentioned earlier that I'm sure you have read our report. These are the excellent panel members whom I had the honor of working with. We have some of them here which I'd like to recognize: Nancy, Betsy, and Maura. You can see their pictures there. I think Maura's is not there, but she was leading the secretariat that was funded by Italy to support the transition to this work. So the panel was created when the risks in the world were already quite high, and there was urgency around finding financing solutions to expand the lending capacity of MDBs. But as you've heard right now from the keynote speech from Minister Sri Mulyani, these risks have even become higher. And today, the work of this panel is even more important. So I'm going to walk through just a few things, but focusing mostly on the recommendations. Because when our review panel was launched, the terms of reference were very clear, that our remit does not extend to assessing the increased capital needs, and that the AAA ratings are not in play. So our work really focused on how we can find solutions without touching the AAA ratings and without looking at new capital or additional capital. So how did we approach it? Basically, we started from two simple questions. First, can the MDBs grow their operations while preserving the benefits of their unique business models? This was the first question we asked. And looking at the MDBs today, what could change in the way they look at capital adequacy that would allow them to do more? So we're already in a very constrained environment. And that was the background of the panel that was constituted in September last year by the G20. So let me now turn to the main conclusions of the panel. We spent a lot of time in framing these recommendations to be very specific, to be practical, and to be actionable. So these are not, I'm not sharing with you today broad conceptual recommendations, they're actually actionable recommendations. So the first two recommendations that you see on the slide there, they're focused on defining shareholder risk tolerance and recognizing the benefit of callable capital, because those go to the core of the MDB capital adequacy. They have the potential to increase lending and lending headroom in particular, quite substantially, and they can be accomplished mainly, though not exclusively, through board-level policy changes. They require shareholders to consider their own approaches to risk, particularly in the definition of risk appetite. But these recommendations, when implemented, will be watched very closely by market participants, and hence they must be done deliberately and be supported by a clear communication strategy. In particular, the second recommendation, which is to build up on the unique features that the MDBs have. The MDBs are the only creatures with callable capital and very strong preferred creditor status. And these two features give them a lot of deep volume and strong muscle. So we commissioned analysis modeling the impact of these preferred creditor terms by comparing the MDB credit performance to that of commercial lenders. The results were striking. Based on publicly available data, so any research analyst can go and redo our work, the expected credit losses on MDB loans to governments were 14 times lower than expected losses faced by commercial lenders. This means that the MDB capital adequacy frameworks, the credit rating agencies' rating methodologies, and private investors all underestimate the value of the preferred creditor terms. More accurate risk weighting incorporating actual MDB track records could free up substantial MDB capital and strengthen the accuracy of the credit rating agency risk modeling. Moreover, more MDB credit performance transparency would also boost private appetite to lend alongside the MDBs. And as Minister Sri Mulyani just said, that's one of the areas we can go to for capital, and we were very happy to see this big ratio. As mentioned previously, another unique feature of MDBs is callable capital. Rating agencies recognize that callable capital gives additional financial security to MDBs, and it gives an uplift to the bond ratings of most major MDBs. Most MDBs, however, do not assign any value to their own callable capital. They should, because callable capital is a guarantee covering the extremely unlikely tail risk of MDB default. Since this extreme tail risk is covered by callable capital, MDBs can safely adjust the risk parameters of their capital adequacy frameworks to create more headroom, in line with the approaches used by rating agencies. Doing so would not materially increase the risk of callable capital being called, and it could be done in ways that preserve the AAA rating of MDB bonds. The panel commissioned another external study that highlighted the circumstances that could actually lead to a capital call, and we found that they're extraordinarily remote. Shareholder governments would therefore not need to modify the way they provision for callable capital in their budgetary frameworks, nor would it necessarily require any change in MDB statutes. For example, the Inter-American Development Bank has already incorporated a portion of callable capital, and it did not require a change in the statutes. So our next recommendation, 3, is around innovation. It includes several options that have been piloted and appear both technically viable and scalable. MDBs can innovate in ways that support and enhance their development mission and model. The panel's proposed financial innovations fall into 3 categories. The first is freeing up space on the MDB balance sheets through risk transfers using private insurance, securitization, and/or third-party guarantees. Offering new forms of hybrid non-voting capital is a second recommendation, particularly to private and public sectors. And then finally, pooling commitments of callable capital to support lending surges during crisis. Implementation complexity varies around these innovations, but headroom benefits are potentially substantial depending on the scale of implementation. We need agile and more flexible ways to support MDB lending rather than relying on general capital increases, which are processes that take considerable time. Now, these innovations were selected by the panel because they share the following characteristics. They are all scalable and adaptable to the circumstances of individual MDBs. And because they are scalable, their impact on lending will grow over time. They offer broader development and environmental gains than simply expanding MDB lending capacity. They do not require changes in the MDB's articles of agreements. They do not change shareholding structures on governance, and all the innovations rest on the very clear trends and factors that are already in the landscape. And each of these is based on precedent. The panel has not pulled any tricks out of our hat. They have all been piloted by one or more of the MDBs so far, and the key recommendation is that MDBs should seek to replicate useful precedents, work collectively to bring down the cost of innovation, and by doing so, they will improve the possibilities for further innovations. The final recommendations, engagement with rating agencies and enabling environment for, I don't know why it's not moving, oh, there we go, environment for capital adequacy, these can be pursued without delay and irrespective of the G20's view on the other recommendations. They pose relatively low political and technical challenges, and they require modest resources. Potential gains in lending capacity are indirect. They would materialize only over the medium term and are not readily quantifiable. But the proposed reforms would improve the way MDBs and shareholders manage capital adequacy and decide capital needs now and in the future. Risks are minimal and are far outweighed by the risks of inaction. Engaging with the credit rating agencies is a key aspect of our overall approach. Their methodologies differ sometimes in ways that are hard to understand, and there is scope for deeper analysis on specific issues. And I'm confident that the collaboration between us and the rating agencies can be fruitful, and that they do have an open mind to arguments and evidence, and indeed have evolved their approaches in the past. Constraints imposed by the credit rating agency methodologies may impose restrictions in what MDBs can do today in terms of risk appetite and innovations and so on. But they should not be taken as immutable constants. Engagement, including by the shareholders, can help to build understanding, and coordinated communication and direction of the MDB sector as a whole would go a long way to influencing rating agencies. But also peer analysis is a key credit analysis tool, and the relative flexibility of the CRA approaches could be an asset for us here. This is another reason why it is very hard for the panel to provide quantified responses, because this is a dynamic process. So the last recommendation is around data governance, transparency, and the ability to really have a place where these issues can be discussed and engaged. There is a well-established track record with data collected across a whole range of MDBs from the sovereign and non-sovereign side of credit performance, that if we can actually share more statistics with a broader range of users, it would show the real value of the unique MDB business model. It is crucial for the governance of MDBs, and particularly for shareholders, in the way they govern the efficiency of capital use, to have a space where they can discuss MDB issues. And that's why we recommend the setup of an MDB financial forum. One of the things we heard from the credit rating agencies was the need for an empirical basis for evaluating preferred creditor status. So we need to be able to compare the track record of MDBs versus commercial institutions, which is eminently doable. The value is very high of these statistics being released. Value is particularly high for private investors, for credit rating agencies and shareholders, all of whom have a strong interest in better understanding the credit performance of MDBs. Last but not least, the panel recommends that the MDBs share disaggregated statistics, anonymized of course, from a strengthened GEMS database. That will provide hard market building evidence to enable credit rating agencies and private investors to assess MDB public and private risk more accurately. I'm running out of time, so I will close with a few key messages. We as a panel found that there are a number of areas for future work, which we highlight in our report, so I will skip to them. But I'd like to focus on two key aspects. First, I'm very pleased that the G20 welcomed the report. And Honorable Minister, thank you for referring to it again once again here today. and also to see the commitment by the G20 to continue to engage with the recommendations that we've put forward. Many of the issues, of course, require prioritization, further analysis, and choices in the specific context of individual MDBs. However, it is critical to define specific and concrete deliverables and a detailed timetable for each individual recommendation, both at the institution level and from the G20 where applicable. And that's why I'm very happy to see that both the co-chairs of the IFI working group are here, because they've already started to work on that process for a roadmap. This will be very important to maintain momentum to the work shared by the G20 group with the launch of the review. My second main message to you is a big part of that work that has to be handled has to be done by the MDBs themselves. However, as a panel, we think that the role of the G20 could play a very critical role in maintaining political momentum and in encouraging the MDBs in the consideration and implementation of these recommendations. It is critical to work collectively and strategically. And I think that's why we're also very happy that centers like the CGD are taking this up and continuing the dialogue. We need things to happen now, and therefore start with what you can do. Thank you very much.
I know you do. Thank you very much. I want to say goodbye to Sri Mulyani, and, who has to leave, and you have to accompany her. So we're going to move now to a panel discussion. So I'm going to invite the panelists to come up. And Byung-Sik Jung, who is the co-chair of the International Financial Architecture Working Group, is going to be moderating this panel. So welcome to you. And then the other panelists are William Roos, the other co-chair of the working group and Assistant Secretary in the French Treasury, Roberta Casali, Roberta's there as well, who is the Vice President for Finance and Risk Management at the Asian Development Bank. So it's important to get the perspective from the finance side of the MDBs on these recommendations. Then we have Alejandro Villa, there he is, yep, who is the Managing Director and Regional Head for Sovereign Ratings at Moody's. Everybody is referring to the ratings agency, so we should get directly from him how they see this. And finally, Kabi Leggett, who is the Managing Director and Global Head of Public Sector and Development Organizations at the Standard Chartered Bank. So from a commercial bank perspective. So over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to the special seminar regarding capital adequacy framework of MDB. As you know, Indonesian presidency and Center for Global Development host this seminar to listen diverse views from key stakeholders, MDB management, and the shareholders, and credit rating agencies, and private investors regarding the recommendation proposed by the expert panel for the capital adequacy framework of MDB. The G20 EPA working group circulated the recommendation to members to get their feedbacks in July. Most of the members broadly supported the recommendations. However, some recommendations, as Dr. Freni introduced to us, such as changing of risk appetite and call of capital, had mixed views. Some members supported, but some members had some reservation on the recommendation. A few recommendations, such as liquidity pool by the central bank, had negative response from members. Based on those recommendations, EPA co-chair, working group co-chair, proposed next step, future work, including drafting roadmap for the recommendations in September, actually last EPA working group meeting. At the time, there was a consensus that it is MDB management and shareholders who deliver the recommendation and decide how to approach the recommendations. Therefore, we invited today ADB from MDB side and shareholders from shareholders' side, the firms, to listen their views on the recommendations. Especially from ADB side, we are going to listen how ADB approached the recommendations today. On the other hand, credit rating agencies' rating methodology is a really key factor in implementation of the recommendation, as Dr. Preni nicely explained to us, because MDB management and shareholders would not do anything that could deteriorate their AAA credit rating credit ratings. That's the key factors. So we will listen to credit rating agencies, their views on the recommendation and advice that MDB management and shareholder could take into account going forward. In addition to that, MDB's co-financing with the private investor is very crucial, given that the development financing is not sufficient. Actually, the recommendation proposed the innovation, such as the transferring risk to the private sector as a tool boost the development financing. In that regard, we invited today Standard Charters to have their views on the recommendations today. Let me introduce how to proceed today's discussion as a moderator. I'm going to give 5 to 6 minutes to each panelist for their views on the recommendations. And based on the discussions, I'll ask a couple of questions to the panelists. If the time is allowed, I'm going to open the floor to the audience to get further questions. I'm very much delighted to be with the distinguished panelists from MDB management side and credit rating agency and private investors, even shareholders. Without further ado, let me invite the first. By the way, I'm going to introduce each panelist when they have turn to make remarks. Okay. Without further ado, let me invite the first panelist, Mrs. Robert Cecily at ADBs. Yes. Let me introduce shortly. The Vice President for Finance and Risk Management of ADBs. Mrs. Cecily Cecily is a financial expert with more than 30 years of executive experience in central banking and the financial sector. And she has a deep knowledge and understanding of the international development agenda and the dynamics and expertise, complexities of the work environment in multilateral institutions. She will give us ADB's general view on the recommendation, and I mentioned earlier the ADB's approach to those recommendations. Okay, Roberta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And first of all, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this important exchange between us. We welcome the report. It's a useful document. It's certainly always very important to share knowledge on a topic such as the capital management for MDBs that is certainly a complex one, and the collective exercise brings us value. However, we should remember that MDBs are far from being homogeneous. They differ in terms of their mixes, the mix of their business clients, their geographies, how close they are to reach the capital constraints. And so we have to do the exercise, as you were saying, in each reality, in each MDB, and given our specificity. The timing of this report for us, for ADB, is perfect, because we are right now undergoing our capital adequacy framework review. We do this exercise every 3 years. So the report for us is a very good piece of knowledge, of information to carefully consider. Let me say also that many of the recommendations resonate with us and are in fact already applied internally at ADB. And let in particular highlight three aspects. First of all, AAA. We must maintain the AAA because this gives us the possibility to be able to assess the market in any moment and when is needed for the amount that is needed. So the risk appetite should not be jeopardized by any recommendation. And in particular, we do not follow any credit agency's formulae, but we assess our risk appetite internally. We differentiate between portfolios with credit preferred status from those that do not have the preferred credit status. We have defined our own country risk model, and this was an exercise based on the observation of historical 30 years data coming from peer MDBs. And this model has been validated by an external expert. So the model is internally constructed, is sound, and is externally validated. Second aspect, we are very active on innovation, and in particular, we have put in place risk transfer to third parties, and we are promoting innovation towards both on sovereign and non-sovereign, promoting shareholders and third parties guarantees that leave and give us more space in the lending towards our developing member countries. And finally, on the exposure exchange agreement, we have developed those agreements with other peer counterparties, with other peer MDBs to reduce concentration risk. We have done a very useful operation, in particular with the Inter-American Development Bank. And again, on recommendation 5, which is very important, corporate governance. We count on a very constructive dialogue, let me tell, continuous dialogue with our board, and that is very well competent, engaged, and especially with the Audit and Risk Committee. As regards the important aspect of fostering dialogue with the credit rating agencies, yes, of course, we welcome this recommendation, and we would like to have more dialogue that exceed, of course, the one-on-one dialogue that each of us already has with the credit rating agencies. And I think, let me stop here, and then I can take other questions, or if you want.
Well, thank you, Roberta. I participated in the ADB audit team's discussion at the time. I was very much delighted to know that ADB already kicked off the implementation of the recommendation. I believe that ADB is one of the leading MDB for the recommendation of for the implementation of the recommendation. I'm very happy to hear that. And also ADB showed today they already implementing the balance sheet optimization, such as exposure agreement. It's one of the tools to dilute the risks of the MDB. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to share my order for your reference. I'm going to give the floor to the next speaker, the shareholders, to listen to shareholders, and these are key factors, players for the recommendation. Therefore, I'm going to give the floor to the shareholder. France. Actually, he's also co-chair for the IFA working group, by the way. And then next, the key factors, credit rating agency, please prepare. And then next, private investors, Kavi. Okay, you are the last one. Okay, let me invite Williams. You are not the co-chair now, you are shareholder. Please share your views as a shareholder on the recommendation, and what's the most attractive, welcome the recommendation, or what is the most concerned recommendation from shareholders' perspective, please.
Thank you very much, Byung-sik. It works, it's okay. Yeah. As shareholder, and of course I speak on behalf of France and not all the shareholders, I think first we value a lot MDBs. This is the first element. And that's why we have decided to put capital in MDBs. That's why we are very active as shareholders at the level of the governors, at the level of the board, to engage with MDBs management regarding risk appetite, etc. And we also know that it's very important for MDBs to be assured that there is a continuous support of the shareholders. And for that, we need to ensure, and it is the case, alignment between the strategy of the MDBs and the interest of the shareholders. So it's not what is in your report, but it's very important to stress that as shareholders, we know that it is very important to have the appropriate level of capital, to monitor with the MDBs management the risk management, and to be able to demonstrate the support, the continuous support to MDBs. On top of that, it's true that there have been a lot of expectations regarding this report. Many shareholders at the G20 level, notably, we pushed a lot for this group, independent group to be established and for the report to be published. Why? Because we know that, yes, we need to be ready to put more capital if needed, but first, we want to be sure that the amount of money we have put in MDBs are used in the most efficient way. And it is not a new topic. Of course, we have done that from the start, but it's an opportunity to have an independent view of what is done and to see whether there is room to do more with the existing level of capital. I was 2 years ago at EBRD board of director, and I remember the in-depth discussion we had with the EBRD management regarding the risk appetite, capital adequacy framework, etc. And I think one of the recommendations of the report, which is very important, is to enhance, I could say, the training of board of directors. Of course, it's already done by the MDB management, but I think it's also what we need collectively is to be able, as shareholder, to engage with MDB management, sometimes at a technical level, in order to be sure that we use the capital as efficiently as possible. Then, of course, what is important also, I think, for us is that we had the feeling before that credit rating agencies underestimate the strengths of MDBs. I think it's a key element behind this request for this independent report. And indeed, I think the risk management, the way projects are selected, also the preferred creditor status, we have the feeling that it is taken into account, but probably underestimated. And so that's why the quantitative work you have started to do, and which I think should be continued, is very important to demonstrate to all, and notably credit rating agencies, that the risk MDBs are taking is lower than you think. And it's very important for us to do it with facts and not just words. Then there is no single bullet, silver bullet, one silver bullet in the report. There are a lot of very good ideas, and I just give an example of something which needs to be changed probably. I think about the statutory capital ratio, something all MDBs have inherited from the start, but today MDB management credit rating agencies, you have a more risk-based approach. And so for MDBs which are constrained by this, I could say, old statutory capital ratio, perhaps there is a way to change that, to change the level of where it is written. Today it is written in the article of agreement, so it's quite difficult to change. So it is one of the points you are making in your report. And why it is important to have this collective discussion and not only discussion MDBs by MDBs. I use also the same example. It's difficult for one MDB to change the statutory capital ratio because it's something which is in every MDB. And so this is where the G20 can have value. And for shareholders, it is very important to be able to engage with all MDBs in a coordinated manner in order, if it is, of course, convincing, and it has at the end to be decided by each MDB. We don't want to interfere in the governance. I think it's a very good point. Last element is hybrid capital. I think many MDBs are looking at that. Some of them are well advanced. And I think it's interesting because it is for shareholders, but it's also for other investors. And I think it's something to be looked at carefully. And finally, the GEM platform, something MDBs have put in place. I think probably we could do more. And many shareholders at the G20 level and elsewhere, I think we could be ready to support MDBs in enhancing what can be done through the GEM platform.
Thank you. If there are many the shareholders like France, then I think MDB will move because shareholder support. They are ready to assist their the reform. Then MDB moves, then credit rating agency appropriately reflected their reforming. That's fantastic. But we'll see that other shareholders might have different views in terms of sustaining the AAA credit agency. For example, in case of changing statutory capital ratio, it's not easy job, and also the underestimate MDB by the credit rating agency will listen to the response from the credit rating agency whether credit rating agency really underestimate preferred credit the status and overestimate concentration risks, whether they really value the callable capital in their rating methodology. We will see in the Q&A session. I'm going to bring the question to the Moody's. Okay, then let me invite to next panelist, Alejandro Olivo Villa, head for the Latin America project and infrastructure groups of Moody's. Mr. Villa was responsible for credit ratings for sovereign and sovereign for more than a decade at Moody's and held increasingly senior position in both the government and the private sector. He will give general views from the credit rating agency's perspective. And the key question I expect he will address the key curiosity from us, whether the implementation of the recommendation would affect credit ratings of the MDB, and what should be noted in implementing the recommendation for preventing downgrade of the credit ratings of the MDB.
Thank you.
Alejandro.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure to be here, and especially very happy to report that at least one of the recommendations, we can check it. The engagement with the rating agencies is here and will not go anywhere. So we're delighted to be part of this very important dialogue and very important conversation. We have. Let me just start briefly by way of background. What do we do in Moody's? We recognize the multilateral development banks as a very distinct and unique asset class on its own merits and because of the very specific characteristics that we have been discussing. We rate a little bit over 40 multilateral development banks and international development organizations globally. Roughly about two-thirds of those are AAA, all of them with a stable outlook as of this morning. And the remaining third part of the portfolio is in the very, very high investment grade category. Probably not AAA, but very high AA ratings, and those are, in our perspective, still extremely high quality organizations that have, in our view, pretty much unfettered, unlimited market access and are the very relevant benchmarks in the capital markets where they operate. We monitor this portfolio of 40 so entities through our sovereign team, a team of over 80 analysts globally. We do our annual reviews and assessments of the credit quality of the multilateral development banks through collegial rating committees where the regional expertise, the very specific knowledge and understanding of the MDBs is shared with the team that has a broader perspective to ensure the independence and to ensure that we're being very, very consistent in the way we assess the credit quality of these institutions. We have, as a guide, a rating methodology. We had published this methodology back in June 2019, and then we subsequently updated it in October of 2020 to accompany and to join the trends that we were seeing in the space, namely innovation, new instruments that were being developed. The concept of hybrid capital was there in the latest update, and that is something that very confidently I can put here today. We are very open to maintaining this conversation, and whenever needed, review the methodology to ensure that it's really capturing the developments in the space. It is a methodology, again, taking account of the very specific nature of this asset class. It's a methodology that has a combination of very specific concrete metrics, but also has an element of, to some degree, subjective assessment or a qualitative understanding of how the MDBs operate, recognizing that first, as has been mentioned, not all MDBs are equal. We cannot simply measure them, their complexity, their policy mandate, the space where they operate with a very rigid and restrictive metric. And that said, that methodology, that guide, is really a guide, a starting point to have this more robust understanding of how the mandate and the operations shape the credit quality of the MDBs. In addition, we think we have a very constructive, rich, engaged dialogue with the MDBs, and that is part of how we are able to assess the ratings. I think there have been a couple of comments raised in this conversation, and let me start with the preferred creditor status. In our opinion, we do recognize creditor status. We have in the portfolio for pretty much the most part of the ratings. When we look at the intrinsic financial strength of the entities, and then we look at the final rating, the AAA, you will note that there is on average three, maybe two in some instances, notches of uplift, especially taking into account the preferred creditor status. Now, in these collegial discussions, committees that I was referring to before, we have, you can imagine putting 10 credit analysts on the same table for 2 hours to discuss a credit. Fascinating discussions. Some views say preferred creditor status, at the end of the day, it's really an act of faith recognizing that because they are MDBs and they are the lenders of last resort, and they lend to members of that club, to governments who might be needing that capital, there's clearly an incentive, an alignment of incentives to ensure payment. But when you look at the contractual obligation around preferred creditor status, at least for someone who's not an expert, a very seasoned analyst with all the global perspective, it really sounds like an act of faith more than a concrete documented obligation. In this discussion, one way to go around that and really assess whether we're not capturing enough the preferred creditor status or we may be over-recognizing has to do with data. Has to do with data and data and data. And we live and we thrive and we feel much more comfortable with data. And in that sense, I really welcome the recommendation around the HEMS database, around the existing information that will really help us build additional comfort around the track evidence of preferred creditor status in practice during crisis or in times of booming. So I really think that is a critical point for us. In terms of innovation, in terms of the other measures, to the original question that was posed, and I'll stop because I realize we're running short of time. I would just say, no, we would not expect, given where the ratings are, that any single measure by its own would cause credit pressure, simply because by definition a AAA rating is not expected to move because something changed overnight. That's not how we think of AAA or highly rated credits. That said, we would be very, very open to discussing and conducting the exercise on specific names and how different changes, adjustments could have an impact on the credit potentially. But let me pause there. I'm sure there.
Oh, thank you, Alessandro. Your explanation is quite clear that the single change, it wouldn't impact the AAA. It's a complex. Many things you need to take into account when it comes to bring the AAA ratings. Thank you so much. And also you remind us of the importance of the data. Actually, expert panel faced very much challenges when it comes to analyzing the concentration risk and also preferred credit status because of a lack of data. So we'll continue discussing that issue going forward to address that issues to have the concrete result regarding credit ratings. Okay, let me invite the last panelist, Kabi Regat, Standard Chartered, Global Head of Public Sector and Development Organization, Standard Chartered. Mr. Regat was previously Asia head of the PSDO business. He was responsible for the organization and execution of bonds, syndicated loans, and asset-backed securities in the Greater China and Northeast Asia region. Also, he worked at Goldman Sachs, where he oversaw the firm's Europe, Middle East, and African sovereign ratings, advisory, and risk management functions. Kabi will give us his general view on the reservation too, and also especially the most anticipated recommendation from the private investors' perspective, and what area could work together with the MDB to boost lending headrooms through the cooperation together, such as diluting the risk through the securitizations and insurance and guarantees. It might be very complicated, but it will be very helpful. Please, Kabi.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I find the report quite exciting. I can say, as a representative of the private sector, we're somewhat accustomed to being the last voice in the room when it comes to the multilateral community. And hopefully the report marks the beginning of a change in that. In 2008, there were 16 AAA rated sovereigns in the world. Today there's 9. The US is no longer AAA. Canada is no longer AAA. And the UK is no longer AAA. So that's not to say that some of the recommendations will imperil the balance sheet. What it is to say is that this asset class that we're talking about in today's world of globally constrained debt and deficits is truly unique. And it's probably the one part of the financial system, right, where there is a very, very robust system of credit quality that can be used to hopefully re-energize global recovery. I think when it comes to the question of defining risk appetite, the value of preferred creditor status, the mechanism of callable capital, whether it's a credit issue or a political issue ultimately, I think I'll leave all those very, very important discussions to my colleagues to share their insights on. I think what I'd like to say very briefly is where the private sector can come into this discussion and hopefully really make a difference in terms of what we all truly care about, and that is, delivering the SDGs, building sustainable infrastructure in countries that desperately need it, and meeting all the other aspirations we have around sustainability. We have, on its own, if you free up $100 billion to $300 billion of additional headroom at the multilaterals, that'll make a big headline, but it's not going to change the fate of our world. What will change the fate of our world is if we find a way to bring together the multilateral institutions with their AAA ratings and plug it into this very, very large and still growing pool of global liquidity that wants to be part of this solution. And with the rise of importance of ESG, climate, sustainable finance, that pool of liquidity is getting bigger and bigger. I was just on a panel this morning that was talking about how to marry these two things together. So it's a very topical discussion. At the peak of the pandemic, Standard Chartered did a transaction in Africa. It was $1.1 billion financing. The country was Angola. The objective was to deliver clean water to 2 million households in the capital city. Critical project. Angola was undergoing some credit stress. It was before they had restructured their debt. And they had just been downgraded to CCC. The project had a World Bank guarantee. And on the basis of that, the rest of it all came together. I just mentioned that one project because since then, we've not had another one with the World Bank in this particular type of format. And yet there's tremendous, tremendous demand. So when I look at the report, I think there are so many things. The front recommendations are really exciting for anybody who's sort of paid attention to the world of multilateral development banking. But what really gets me excited is some of the stuff in the back end where we talk about the innovations, about really making funded, unfunded guarantees, risk participations, using the MEGA guarantee more effectively. I've always found it surprising that MEGA draws as a threshold BB-. How many BB- credits are there in Africa today? So it's almost, dare I say, at the edge of the question about relevance. In a world where multilaterals can play a very, very significant counter-cyclical role, stepping into conditions that commercial lenders aren't going to step into, this is a tremendous opportunity. So I applaud the report. I think it's a tremendous piece of work. I devoured it on the flight over to DC this week. And I would just say, I would hope that not only do the recommendations get a very, very close look and are implemented according to each institution as appropriate, but the back-end recommendations around how to truly reorient the way the multilaterals think about engaging the private sector are really get a hard look. And I can assure you that within the private sector, you're pushing on an open door, and you'll have a lot of partners lining up to figure out how we can cooperate and do this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabi. Thank you, Gabi. Not only for this development financing, but also other development finance in, as you mentioned, the sustainable finance and infrastructures. All issues are related with the the co-financing with the private investors, because as you mentioned that there are huge liquidities. In that regard, the innovation proposed by the expert panel is quite crucial for us to calibrate going forward. Okay, and now I'm going to open the Q&A sessions. So let me invite Dr. Freni, the most distinguished expert in the world, on the stage. Okay, I prepared a couple of questions. Let me digest my question first, and if time is allowed, I'm going to open the floor. Okay, I have 4 questions for your preparation. I'm going to ask first. Actually, I prepared the questions whether prepare the credit status, treatments, and also the concentration risks are well appreciated, well taken into account by the credit rating agency. But since Alessandro mentioned slightly, I'm going to skip the questions. But I have one specific question regarding capital, callable capital, because it's very crucial. So Dr. Freni mentioned that already IDB incorporated the callable capital in their capital adequacy framework. By the way, how about the ADB? ADB, does it incorporate the callable capital? You said no?
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Why
would you say?
We do not incorporate or uplift our capital adequacy framework with a portion of callable capital, because we think that all our capital adequacy framework is constructed to preserve the AAA. So we do not want to go there. And that is my short answer to you.
Okay, I understand. You know, when it comes to the channeling the SDL through the multi MDBs, the simple answer from the central banks, no, because reserve asset status is crucial. That's the key hurdle. So like that, MDB is very reluctant to implement the second recommendation, callable capital issues here. So we listen to the answers directly.
May I add that
Sure.
that 2.A is a shareholder, is under the responsibility of shareholders.
Yeah, that's the reason why
So
I said
that's
William
the reason.
supported that MDB can move. Okay, I'm going to give the 3 questions. The first is the benchmarking report issues, and MDB forum, MDB consortium issues. Instead of that callable capital, I'm going to ask Roberto again. Do you think it's useful for the MDB to have the benchmarking report in terms of compatibility among MDBs to improve, to facilitate MDB to act for the implementation of the recommendation? And recommendation of the expert panel also point out that the MDB forum or consortium could be useful to enhance the collaboration among MDBs by utilizing the existing risk team networks. So what's your view about the recommendation?
As I also said at the beginning, I mean, I really think that a collective exercise of sharing knowledge and the provision of data that we can all together get in a very structured way, in a manner that is useful to the work of all of us. And I really believe that today we all agree on this. It's crucial, it's fundamental. So I welcome this recommendation of the report, as well as was mentioned before, GEM, the fact that we can have a database that in a confidential way can be assessed by credit agencies, by private sector, can be an improvement. Of course, it should be an independent legal entity, should be created in a way that is sound and appropriate for the scope, and also has resource to be sustainable.
Okay, thank you so much for your quite clear explanation to us. Actually, when we, as a co-chair, drafted the roadmap for the implementation, in order to secure the implementation of the recommendation, we thought that the MDB consortium or forum should be there. But I'm not sure how much it is workable, but since Robert mentioned that it is very crucial, therefore I expect that MDB will move toward that direction. Actually, World Bank also mentioned that they already had some deliberation among the risk expert teams, the existing risk teams. That kind of activity could be linked with the establishment of the MDB forum in the future.
To complete the information, the GEMS consortium, which ADB participate as other multilateral development banks, much before the report was published, was already taken to improve the way in which the GEMS work. So this is a recommendation that is contained in the report, but was already elaborated by the banks that participate to the GEMS. So it's something that was ongoing, the so-called GEMS 2.0, and reflection and discussion about this were already there. So
okay, then it is indispensable, inevitable to raise the questions regarding GEM consortium, turning the GEM consortium into standing alone entity. Actually, when we got the feedback from the members regarding that idea, the many members mentioned that, what's that GEM? What's the GEM? It's a new thing to some members. And also there is some concern regarding the privacy issues, confidentiality issues. So I'm going to open the floor, regarding that question to each panelist. Please show your views on the establishment of GEM as a standalone entity in the future. What is the pros and cons of that idea? So then.
I don't see any downside. I understand the potential limitations in terms of sharing open specific data, but in an aggregated manner that's keeps the confidentiality and all those concerns. It would be very welcome, and I really don't see any downside to that.
Okay, and Kari?
Yeah, very similar view.
Then William.
I think it will be my last speech, and then I have to leave because.
Okay.
But I think the GEMS or other recommendations, what we expect at the G20 level is for each MDB to work within its own governance to discuss the different recommendations with the board, also internally with the management, and to come back to update us about what could be done and where the G20 could be useful. And I think that the GEMS, perhaps, but we are waiting for the MDB proposal because it is an MDB object. So we are waiting for proposals to what could be the best way for the G20, for the other shareholders to support this project, this initiative. You have good ambition. You have already ambition. Do you need a support from us? It is the key question we are asking you.
Okay, since in 15 minutes there is the G20 drafting session will start. Therefore, we need to summarize this question. Before summarizing, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Freddy for his very precious remarks. Especially, I'm going to give these very important questions. According to your experience and insight, what's the best way to have MDB keep moving toward the implementation of the recommendation?
Thank you very much for the question. I think, first of all, it will be very important for the G20 and the other shareholders to maintain political pressure and support for the implementation to take place. Historically, we've seen that that makes a big difference. Second, I'm very happy to hear the private sector and the credit rating agencies would actually value a lot of the recommendations that have been made, because both of those are actually positive for the MDBs, because the ratings can be maintained and they can have access to large pools of liquidity, which are very much needed now. So I think that's the second element of dynamic that needs to be continued. Third, forums like the one we are having here, if those continue to be had and keeps the agenda on top of the hot burner, will be very important going forward so that the issues can be debated, discussed, and attention can continue to go through each of these recommendations. But there's also a very important role of the roadmap that the IFI working group is looking at, because that's going to set the stage for how the G20 can actually follow through with these issues. And then finally, as we've heard from Roberta and from the other MDBs, the internal MDB discussions to look at each of these recommendations, assess them for their importance and the way to implement them such that they don't create the risks that some are concerned about. And I'm very happy that today S&P issued their opinion on our report, and they conclude that they don't see anything in our report that could cause a downgrade. And I had Alejandro say the same thing today. So you have Moody's and S&P coming up and saying that. So we think the MDBs could really push forward and look at this quite seriously.
Okay, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude today's discussion without giving the floor to the audience for the time constraints. I'm very much impressed with your insightful observation regarding today's topics. For your information, actually, G20 working group plans to have that feedback from board members and shareholders by a spring meeting next year. Based on the feedbacks, we will draft our roadmap for the implementation. Probably, I expected that under the India presidency by July. That's my expectations. And then I will see if, like ADB, many MDBs supported the idea GEM consortium the turning into the standalone entity. That could be also discussed in our EPA working group. That's my expectations. Thank you so much for your participation and your sharing your insightful ideas today with the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the panel. So just before we then conclude, I'd like to ask Domenico Fanizza, please, to give us his thoughts. He is the executive director for Italy and a number of other countries in the IMF board, and has been very closely involved with this agenda. So Domenico.
Thank you very much. Shall I talk from here or?
Yeah, or come up here.
Maybe it's easier. Maybe it is easier this way. Okay. First of all, I should thank you all, and particularly it's a great pleasure to see Masood, and thank you for the hospitality. Also, I need to thank Franny for the fantastic job. The report is impressive, not only for the content and recommendation, but how easy it is to read. I mean, I was looking at it, and I found it very, very well done. And of course, I need to thank all the components of this thing. Well, look, Italy has promoted this stream of work during its G20 presidency. And we are very thankful that Indonesia has picked it up, and we are still supporting it. A few things I would like to say on that. In a sense, this is only part of the issue. The issue is not only how to make sweat capital better. It's very important. But also we need to look at the overall balance sheet. We need to look at the quality of the asset side. And that's the key variable, I think. Look, it was clear. Preferred creditor status is in the eye of the beholder. And there are many people who think so, that they are under creditor status, and the more there are, the less preferred creditor status is worth. So we cannot rely too much on that. I'm not saying that it's not. We have to make sure that the assets are good in the sense that they really promote growth. Okay, so something that I want to take out of the picture is the idea is only how to get more resources. No, the idea is how to make capital sweat, and then how to make sure that actually that money, those resources, go to finance project, infrastructure, but even other things. Private sector is fundamental. Policy reform, under which will not get. So it's not at all an issue of resources. I mean, even now, I mean, I see at IMF, I've seen there was every moment there's a good moment to ask for more resources. No, that's how bureaucracy works. No, that's and sometimes there are very good reasons for that. I mean, the COVID crisis, the food prices now, yes, but that's not the real job of the multilateral development banks. The job is to help when needed, but the real job is to promote growth and transformation. And there it's very important that it's not, we do not rely just on giving money to government. We need to think to private sector, and the private sector is important both as sources, as Mr. Lemet was saying, as a source for financial firepower, but also as a destination for loans. And the important thing is that even in private sector, the loans should not be go to the big public corporations and we should think of those should go to the private sector with that are actually dynamic and not represent only government policies. And that's, I think, it's the key. And that will help also to make the case with the shareholders on the fact that more money is needed. We don't need to give the impression that we do. We ask resources to the shareholders just to do policy-based lending. And in fact, what Italy has done during its presidency is trying to start this work, but at the same time to start also the principle on the policy-based lending, where the idea that it's a way to give money away too easy, with little payback in terms of development. So that's very important. And then I'll close it with one observation. Look, I've preconceived ideas in a sense that I think that the decision of risk tolerance is a decision of the board, of the shareholder. Staff has nothing to do with that. Staff and management, of course, staff and management have to tell the shareholders, well, look, you want more risk? These are the consequences. You risk to jeopardize your AAA rate. And then they take the information. No, I understand that the situation it's different from I've experienced in multilateral development banking where staff never wants to take much risk, wants to always be protected and always has more capital. No, there are some that ask one-to-one. But here at the fund, when we have started to talk about risk seriously, it's exactly the opposite, because the fund does not go to the market. So the decision the risk analysis is extremely protected by the staff. They want to do all of that and present the board with the decision that they make without the board saying, why are you taking these risks? No? So that's, for me, very important. The shareholders, it's their money. The shareholders have to decide that that's. But I think I've talked too much, and I'll take, again, the opportunity to thank everybody who has listened and to this fantastic discussion. Thanks again.